At the pediatric ward doorway, my daughter said, "Wait outside." The words fell with the sharpness of glass breaking, and though she didn't raise her voice, they cut through me as if I had been caught trespassing in a place I no longer belonged. I had followed her quietly down the long, sterile corridor, my footsteps echoing on the polished linoleum, staying half a step behind because that is how it has always been with her, she leading, me following. But I didn't expect her to turn on me in that instant, not here, not in this place where I thought my presence was natural, almost required. Wait outside. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. Her hand pressed against the doorframe, her shoulder angled in a way that blocked the entrance. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of the white sheets, the small bed, the clutter of beeping machines, and a faint squeak of a child's toy left on the tray table. My grandchild's world, closed to me. I froze. For a moment, my body moved slower than my mind. I clutched the strap of my handbag tighter, waiting for her to change her expression, to soften, to realize the harshness of what she had just said. But she didn't. She was already turned inward, her focus drawn to the room, to the child I had come to see, to the crisis that had brought us all here. I swallowed. My throat felt thick. "Of course," I whispered, though the words scraped against my pride. I didn't want her to think I was arguing. I didn't want to create a scene in a place where silence seemed stitched into the walls. So, I stepped back, nodding as if she had given me some reasonable instruction. The hallway stretched on, a long ribbon of muted colors, beige and pale green, lit by fluorescent panels that hummed faintly overhead. Nurses passed by, brisk in their movements, their shoes squeaking softly. I turned toward the vending machine at the corner, as though I had already intended to go there. As though it was my choice. The coffee tasted like bitter water, the kind that sits too long in a pot and carries the smell of burnt plastic. I held the flimsy paper cup in both hands, its heat seeping into my palms, and I sat on one of the hard plastic chairs nearby. From there, I could hear the steady beep of monitors through the doorway, each note falling like a reminder that I was close but not close enough. Present, but not permitted. It is a strange kind of loneliness to be excluded by your own child. To be told, without explanation, that your presence is neither wanted nor needed. I thought back to when she was small, when every fever, every scrape on her knee, every bad dream called me to her side. My hands were always the ones she reached for. My face was the one she scanned for in a crowd. And now, here I sat, reduced to the role of an outsider sipping stale coffee, like some distant relative who had shown up uninvited. I kept replaying the words in my head. Wait outside. They weren't laced with anger, but they carried a finality that told me there was no room for negotiation. Something had shifted between us, perhaps long ago, and I was only now recognizing its weight. I told myself it didn't matter, that the important thing was the child's well-being, that I shouldn't take it personally. But the human heart doesn't obey reason as quickly as we'd like. It bruises at the smallest slight, and bruises, even invisible ones, have a way of spreading under the surface. I took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at its taste. My eyes lingered on the door. I wanted to lean against the wall just outside, to listen, to catch even a sliver of what was happening inside that room. But I knew if I did, she would notice. She would see me hovering like an unwanted shadow, and it would only deepen the wedge already pressing between us. So I stayed planted in the chair, hands folded around the cup, legs crossed tightly as though to contain myself. The beeping continued, steady and unrelenting. Sometimes it slowed, sometimes it quickened, and I found myself aligning my breaths with it. Inhale with the beep, exhale with the next. It gave me something to hold on to, something to measure time against, in those long minutes where I had nothing else to do but sit and think. I thought about all the small exclusions that had led to this one. The family trip last summer where she sent me photos but didn't ask me to come. The birthday party where she said there wasn't enough space, so perhaps I could visit another day. Each moment brushed off as logistics, as circumstance, but together they began to form a pattern I had been reluctant to admit. A pattern of being pushed gently, but firmly, to the margins of her life. I shifted in my seat, watching people pass by. Other families came and went, their faces drawn with worry, their voices low. Some were invited in immediately, gathered close around a small bed. Others lingered like me, waiting in the hallway, though I could tell from their expressions that their waiting was out of necessity, not exclusion. They were strangers to the patient, acquaintances, coworkers, neighbors. I was not a stranger. Or at least, I hadn't believed I was. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the cup again. I told myself it was the coffee, the caffeine stirring my nerves. But I knew it was the ache of realizing my place in my own family had shifted without my consent. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling tiles with their neat grid of tiny holes. The hum of the lights pressed against my ears, merging with the distant beeps. I wondered if anyone else could see me there, alone, and imagine the story behind it. Would they assume I was a grandmother waiting patiently, or would they sense the truth, that I had been asked to remove myself, that I was not trusted to enter? It is humiliating in a way words can't fully capture, to be told you are unnecessary. To be told with such quiet authority that your love, your presence, might not make things better but worse. I finished the coffee quickly, more to end its bitter taste than out of thirst. The empty cup felt weightless in my hand, yet symbolic, a small vessel drained of anything worth holding. I crushed it slightly and set it on the low table beside me. My fingers lingered there, pressing into the cardboard, needing the texture to anchor myself in the moment. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My body stiffened against the chair, my legs numb from crossing too tightly. I shifted, uncrossed them, and placed my feet flat on the floor. The action felt grounding, like planting roots, though I was painfully aware those roots had no soil here. I thought of walking away. The idea came suddenly, almost recklessly. To leave the hospital altogether, to reclaim my dignity by removing myself instead of waiting to be permitted. But my grandchild was inside that room. My blood, my heart. Leaving felt like a betrayal, not just of my daughter but of the child who had no say in this arrangement. So I stayed. My staying was my quiet rebellion. The air in the hallway grew cooler as the ventilation shifted. I folded my arms, hugging myself. My ears picked up the rustle of sheets, a muffled laugh from a nurse, a cough from behind another door. Life continued, but mine seemed to pause there, condensed into the soundscape of machines and footsteps. I realized I was no longer angry. Anger had flared and passed quickly, replaced by something quieter, heavier, sorrow. A sorrow that felt older than the moment, as if it had been waiting in the corners of my heart for years, only now finding the right opportunity to reveal itself. I straightened in my chair, exhaling slowly, and told myself, remember this. Remember how it feels to be asked to step aside. Because this was not just about a doorway, or a hospital room, or a cup of bad coffee. It was about a shift in how my daughter saw me. A shift I could not unsee now that it had been named. And as the minutes stretched, I began to understand, the waiting was not temporary. It was becoming the shape of my place in her life. The hallway didn't change, though the hours shifted. That was the cruel part of hospitals, the sameness, the repetition. The same hum of machines, the same clatter of carts rolling by, the same antiseptic smell that clung to my clothes like a reminder that I didn't belong here any more than a misplaced chair in a corridor. I glanced at the door every few minutes, watching as nurses went in and out, as my daughter's voice rose faintly from within and then fell again. She was allowed in, trusted with presence. I wasn't. I tried to keep myself busy with little things. I checked the time on my phone though I had no one to call. I scrolled through old photographs I had stored there, images of birthdays and Christmas mornings where the room had once been full of laughter and my place had been unquestioned. My granddaughter's face smeared with icing, my grandson balancing on my lap, my daughter smiling at the camera, tired but proud. We had been together then. My being there had been natural, assumed. Not something to be debated at a doorway. But the more I looked at the pictures, the more they turned into accusations. Had I missed the signs? Was my daughter slowly pushing me out, smile by smile, until one day I was standing with a vending machine cup instead of a warm hand in mine? I closed the phone quickly, pressing it face down on my lap, because sometimes memories sting worse than present wounds. The coffee had left my mouth dry, so I bought water from the machine. The coins clinked down the slot, the bottle dropped with a thud. I twisted the cap too tightly and spilled some on my sleeve. A small accident, but enough to make me feel clumsy, out of place, as though even the machine knew I wasn't meant to be there. I dabbed at the sleeve with a tissue, embarrassed though no one was watching. I thought of the words she had used. Wait outside. Not would you mind? Not could you just give us a moment? There was no cushioning, no recognition of what she was asking me to surrender. It was a command, and I had obeyed it without protest. That obedience gnawed at me. Once, I had been the one giving directions, telling her to wait in the car, to hold my hand, to stay close. Now the roles were reversed, and I was finding out that obedience, when turned back on you, feels like a cold humiliation. I leaned forward in my chair, elbows on my knees, hands clasped. The beeps inside the room continued. Sometimes there was a new sound, a shuffle, a faint laugh that I knew wasn't my daughter's. Perhaps a doctor making a joke to lighten the moment, or perhaps the child stirring. My heart twisted each time. I wanted to be there for those laughs, to be present when the fear eased, but my body stayed planted, obedient, in a chair no one had chosen for me. Across from me sat another woman. Middle-aged, tired eyes, clutching her purse. She gave me a faint smile, one of those polite acknowledgments shared by people who know better than to speak. We were both waiting, but I wondered if her waiting was by choice or by force. I wanted to ask, but pride stopped me. I didn't want to admit that I had been excluded. So I smiled back, a thin, brittle curve of the lips, and lowered my gaze. My mind wandered backward. To a time when my daughter was only 8, lying in bed with a fever. I remember sitting by her side through the night, holding a damp cloth to her forehead, whispering nonsense stories until she drifted back into sleep. She had clung to my arm then, needing me to anchor her in the world of sickness and dreams. The thought that she could grow from that girl into this woman, this mother who now found me unnecessary, was almost unbearable. I tried to rationalize. Maybe she was protecting me, sparing me the sight of something too frightening, too raw. Maybe she thought she was being kind, shielding me. But if kindness was her intent, why had her words carried such weight, such dismissal? Why had her eyes avoided mine when she spoke them? A person can endure almost anything when they know they are wanted. But even small exclusions, when repeated, can hollow a heart. The vending machine buzzed behind me. Someone bought chips. The crackle of the packet tore through the stillness, and I resented how normal it sounded, how casual. Didn't they know how the world had just shifted at a doorway not 10 feet away? Didn't they know how fragile I felt, how sharp the silence was in my chest? But of course they didn't. To them, this was just another hallway, another waiting hour. I adjusted the strap of my handbag, pressing it closer to my side, as though it were some shield. Inside was a small knitted toy I had made for the child, a soft bear, clumsy but full of love. I had thought I would walk in, place it on the bed, watch small fingers clutch at it. But the bear remained hidden, suffocated in the dark pocket of my bag. I touched it through the fabric, feeling the outline of its ears, and my eyes burned. The toy was useless if I wasn't allowed to hand it over myself. Gifts don't carry the same warmth when passed through intermediaries. Time dragged. My body began to ache from the rigid posture. I stood, walked a few paces down the hallway, then back again. Each time I passed the doorway, I slowed, listening for a sound that might include me. My daughter's voice, the child's laugh, anything. But all I caught were muffled fragments, as though I was pressing my ear to a world no longer mine. I thought of leaving again. Not just the hallway this time, but the hospital entirely. To step outside into the evening air, to breathe freely, to reclaim myself. Yet something in me resisted. I couldn't abandon the child. Even if I wasn't wanted, I wanted them. Love has no doorways. It seeps through, it waits, it lingers even when it's uninvited. So I sat again. I told myself I could endure it. That sitting outside with bad coffee and bottled water was a small price compared to the child's health. But the truth was simpler, I had nowhere else to go. My life had narrowed, over the years, to these few connections, and to lose them would be to lose the last threads of myself. At one point, the door opened. My daughter stepped out, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes tired. For an instant, I straightened, hope flaring that she might call me in, invite me to share the space. But she only adjusted her sweater, glanced at her phone, and went back in, closing the door gently behind her. She didn't even look at me. That was worse than the command. Indifference can pierce deeper than rejection. Rejection at least acknowledges your presence. Indifference erases you. I sat still for a long time after that, staring at the door handle, waiting for it to move again. But it stayed motionless, a silent guard keeping me out. And in that stillness, something quiet began to stir inside me. Not anger this time, not sorrow, but a faint realization I had allowed my world to shrink around her approval. Every look, every word, every gesture from my daughter weighed more than it should, because I had made her the measure of my worth. Sitting there, excluded, I began to sense the edges of that mistake. It was a fragile thought, barely formed, like the first light of dawn barely touching the horizon. But it was there. And I wondered, for the first time, if waiting outside might not only be her command, but my chance to decide whether I would always obey. By the time the clock above the nurse's station crept past another hour, I had stopped counting the minutes. They blended together, a long blur of footsteps and machine beeps, punctuated only by the occasional swing of the door that never swung for me. My legs ached from sitting, but when I stood, my body felt too heavy to pace. Waiting had its own weight, and I carried it without choice. I kept glancing at the door as though my eyes could will it open. But nothing changed. The hallway had emptied, the woman across from me had been called in at last, and when she came back out, her face softened by relief, she walked past me without a word. I envied her. She had been included, she had been trusted to step into the circle. I was left circling outside, the way a dog circles the table but is never offered a chair. The thought made me wince, to compare myself to an animal begging at the edge of a meal. But isn't that what exclusion does? It reduces you, strips you of dignity until you imagine yourself grateful for scraps of presence. My daughter's indifference replayed in my mind like a cruel recording. The way she hadn't looked at me when she stepped into the hall. The way her words earlier had carried no hesitation, no awareness that she was wounding me. I began to wonder if this was deliberate, if she knew exactly what she was doing, or if I had simply become invisible to her in the busyness of her life. Invisible. That word lodged itself in me. When had I stopped being seen? I remembered birthdays where I had baked cakes, carefully icing names and numbers, waiting for her to notice the effort in each swirl of frosting. She would laugh, blow out candles, and I would glow just from watching. Later, she began buying store cakes instead, saying it was easier. My cakes went unrequested, then unbaked, and eventually, unnoticed. A small exclusion, hardly worth mentioning, yet standing here years later, I felt the sting of it. It's never the single word, or the single moment, that changes a relationship. It's the accumulation. The way small gestures add up, like stones dropped into a bag until it's too heavy to carry. Sitting outside that doorway, I felt the full weight of all those stones pressing against me. I tried to tell myself it was natural, that children grow and lives shift. But it didn't feel natural to be barred from the room where my grandchild lay. Nature is meant to expand love, not shrink it. My exclusion wasn't the slow drift of life, it was a door shut in my face. I sipped the last of my water, the bottle empty too quickly. I thought of going downstairs, finding something more to drink, maybe a sandwich. But the fear of missing something, of the door opening, of my daughter calling for me at last, kept me rooted. Hunger was easier to bear than the risk of being absent at the one moment I was needed. A nurse passed and glanced at me with a kind of curiosity. I wondered what she saw, a grandmother waiting, or a woman discarded. I wanted to tell her, I belong in that room. But I didn't. My silence was its own prison. To pass the time, I pulled out the knitted bear again, this time slipping it into my lap. I stroked its ears, the yarn soft beneath my fingertips, though slightly uneven from my clumsy hands. I had made it with love, every stitch a prayer for the child. But holding it there in secret, I realized how much of my love had turned into private gestures, things unseen, unacknowledged. Love kept in bags, in pockets, in silence. Love that never quite reached the ones it was meant for. A memory rose, uninvited. My own mother, years ago, standing at the edge of my life. I remembered how I had once brushed her off, thinking I was too busy, too independent. I had told her I couldn't talk long, that I had things to do. I hadn't thought of it as cruelty then, only necessity. But sitting here now, the echo of her disappointed eyes came back to me, sharp and undeniable. Perhaps this was the circle repeating. Perhaps my daughter was giving me the same distance I had once given. The thought burned. We inherit more than we realize, not just features, but habits of neglect. I felt a sudden rush of shame, followed by an ache that was larger than myself. I wanted to reach through time, to hold my mother's hand, to tell her I understood now. But all I had was this hallway, this vending machine coffee, this unopened door. The longer I waited, the more something hardened inside me. Not bitterness, I feared that, but a quiet steel. I couldn't keep letting my worth be decided by whether I was permitted into rooms. I couldn't keep waiting for invitations that might never come. I sat up straighter, adjusting the strap of my bag, tucking the knitted bear back inside. My chest felt hollow, but also strangely clear. My daughter had made her choice. I could not change it tonight, maybe not ever. But I could choose how I held myself. I glanced at the doorway one last time, watching the faint light spill across the floor. I whispered under my breath, a promise no one else could hear, I will not beg to belong. The words steadied me, even as sorrow lingered. Because sometimes the cruelest lesson is also the most necessary, that love does not guarantee inclusion, and that dignity must be protected even when affection is withheld. I folded my hands in my lap, listening once more to the beeps. They no longer sounded like invitations. They were simply reminders of life moving on, with or without me. And I knew, as the night stretched further, that my place in this family would never be the same again. By the time the fluorescent lights flickered above me, buzzing faintly as though they too were weary of this endless night, my body felt stiff and sore. I shifted in the hard chair, pressing my hand against the small of my back, wincing at the dull ache. My feet tingled with pins and needles from sitting too long, yet I stayed rooted. Not by comfort, but by habit. Waiting had become its own strange tether. I realized I hadn't eaten since morning. Hunger gnawed at me in a quiet, hollow way, but I brushed it aside. To leave the hallway meant risking being absent if she finally opened the door. So I told myself the gnawing was good, a reminder that I was still alive, still capable of enduring. My life had narrowed to endurance, and in endurance, I thought I would prove my love. But the longer I sat, the more I began to see how little endurance was valued. No one rewarded it. No one noticed it. My daughter didn't glance into the hallway to see how faithfully I kept my vigil. No nurse came to say, "You're so devoted." Devotion performed in silence is invisible. And invisible, I feared, was becoming the sum of who I was. I leaned my head back against the cold wall and closed my eyes. The hum of the machines inside, the squeak of shoes down the corridor, the occasional muffled voice, they blended into a kind of lull, broken only by my own thoughts. And those thoughts were not gentle. They asked me questions I had avoided for years. Why had I allowed myself to be pushed aside so easily? Why had I clung so tightly to the hope of inclusion, as though my daughter's permission were the only measure of my worth? Why had I let her indifference weigh more heavily than my own dignity? The questions pricked like needles. Yet with them came memories, small, unremarkable moments that now glowed with new meaning. The time she planned a family trip and sent me photographs afterward. The way she smiled in the pictures, her children's arms looped around her, while I sat at home waiting for a phone call that never came. The birthday party she held in her yard, with balloons bobbing in the background, and she said later, almost casually, it was just easier not to make it too crowded. I had nodded, telling her I understood. I always understood. But did I? Or did I only pretend, swallowing the hurt to keep the peace, believing that quiet compliance would buy me favor? The vending machine hummed again, a low mechanical groan as someone bought a drink. I opened my eyes. A young father stood there, fumbling with coins, his shoulders tight with worry. He didn't notice me, but I noticed the way his eyes flicked toward the pediatric ward door, the way his fingers trembled as he punched the buttons. He wanted to be near his child too. And yet, when his turn came, I knew he would be welcomed. Fathers are rarely asked to step aside. A bitterness stirred in me, sharp and unfamiliar. I wasn't used to anger. My life had been lived in gentleness, in compromise, in smoothing the rough edges of conflict. But anger found me there in the hallway, rising like a flame licking the edges of my restraint. It whispered, "You have given everything. Why do you sit here begging for scraps of belonging?" I gripped the strap of my bag tightly, my knuckles whitening. Inside, the knitted bear still waited, silent testimony to the love I carried. But what good was love if it remained unseen, tucked away like contraband? My eyes drifted to the doorway again. I imagined walking in, not asking, not waiting. Simply opening the door, placing the bear in the child's hands, meeting my grandchild's eyes. I imagined standing tall, even if my daughter bristled, even if she told me to leave again. For once, I would not obey. But I didn't move. My body remained in the chair, heavy with habit. My rebellion stayed locked inside my chest. Instead, I whispered to myself, words so quiet they barely existed, yet I felt them reverberate inside me. You are still here. It wasn't much, but it was something. A reminder that though I had been pushed aside, erased, dismissed, I was still breathing, still waiting, still carrying love in a body no command could erase. The hallway clock ticked softly, its second hand dragging in steady rhythm. I watched it for a long time, as though it could measure not just the minutes, but the slow accumulation of resolve. I felt something shifting inside me, subtle but undeniable. Not a surge of power, but a quiet gathering. Like water slowly pooling, finding its weight. I thought of my mother again, and the way I had once excluded her without meaning to. I thought of how easily love can be taken for granted, assumed as permanent even when it is bruised. I wondered if my daughter would one day sit in a hallway like this, waiting for a door that never opened. Would she remember me then? Would she understand what it meant to be left outside? The thought softened my anger. It didn't erase it, but it shaped it into something gentler, a resolve not to let bitterness consume me. I couldn't control my daughter's choices, but I could choose what I carried forward. I reached into my bag again and pulled out the bear. This time, I didn't hide it. I set it on my lap, smoothing the yarn ears with deliberate care. If I couldn't place it in my grandchild's hands tonight, I would hold it openly anyway. Let the world see the love I carried, even if it wasn't invited into the room. A nurse passed, glanced at the toy, and gave me a small, understanding smile. It wasn't much, but it was more acknowledgement than I had received all night. And in that moment, I realized acknowledgement doesn't always have to come from the place we crave it. Sometimes it arrives quietly, from strangers who notice what others overlook. I sat taller after that. Still waiting, still aching, but not invisible. Not entirely. And though the doorway remained closed, I began to imagine a life where my worth wasn't tied to whether it opened. The vending machine coffee had long worn off, leaving only a bitter aftertaste clinging to my tongue. My body was tired, but it was a different kind of tiredness, not just physical, but layered, the weight of years pressing down as if this hallway had distilled my whole life into a single test of patience. Yet something in me had shifted since holding the knitted bear openly. I wasn't hiding anymore, at least not from myself. The toy sat on my lap like a companion, small but present. Each time I smoothed its yarn ears, I felt steadier, as though I was reminding myself that love, even unacknowledged, still mattered. My daughter might not have looked at me, might not have spoken more than 2 words, but the bear reminded me that my presence was not meaningless. I carried devotion, whether or not it was invited. I glanced around at the hallway again. The young father I'd noticed earlier had returned with a soda, his shoulders less tense than before. He went straight into the room without hesitation, the door opening easily for him. I watched the way he disappeared inside, unnoticed, unchallenged. It stung, but this time the sting didn't hollow me. Instead, it clarified something. I had been living as if access was proof of worth. But access, I was beginning to see, was sometimes just chance, circumstance, or someone else's whim. Worth was not measured by doorways. The thought startled me with its simplicity. How had I not seen it sooner? All these years, I had equated inclusion with love, invitation with validation. And yet, here I was, excluded but still loving, waiting but still carrying the fullness of who I was. I reached for my phone again, not to scroll through pictures this time, but to open the small notes app one rarely used. My fingers hesitated over the screen, then began to type. Simple sentences at first. Fragments of feeling. You are more than someone's permission. You are more than waiting. The words looked strange on the screen, as if someone else had written them, but they steadied me. They were mine. I wrote more. About the silence of the hallway, about the ache in my back, about the way exclusion carves you smaller until you decide not to shrink. It wasn't polished, but it was real, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I was doing something that belonged only to me. When I finished, I tucked the phone away and let the words settle. They were small, but they were a beginning. The door opened again a while later. My daughter stepped out, her face weary, her shoulders slumped. She glanced at me briefly this time, and though she didn't speak, there was a flicker, maybe guilt, maybe surprise that I was still there. She adjusted her sweater and went back in. The door closed softly, and once again, I was left with only the faint spill of light beneath the frame. But I noticed something new. Her glance hadn't undone me. It hadn't left me gasping for recognition, the way it might have earlier. It was just a glance, no more, no less. My heart still ached, yes, but it no longer broke at every small dismissal. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. There was strength in this, not the loud, confrontational kind, but the quiet endurance of someone who had begun to understand their own value apart from others' judgments. My mind wandered to the life waiting outside this hospital. My small house with its creaking steps and the garden I had let go wild these past months. The teapot with its chipped spout, the old books stacked by my bedside. They weren't grand things, but they were mine. They were parts of a life I had neglected in my effort to stay available, to be always ready for my daughter's call. I thought, perhaps it was time to reclaim those small things. To tend to the garden again, to brew tea not because someone was visiting but because I wanted to taste its warmth. To knit not just for grandchildren who might never hold the toys, but for myself, for the joy of making. The thought felt radical in its simplicity. I had been waiting so long for inclusion that I had forgotten I could create meaning without it. The hallway seemed less oppressive after that. The beeps from inside no longer sounded like reminders of my distance, but simply the rhythm of life moving on. The chairs were still hard, the air still sterile, but my posture shifted. I wasn't slumped in defeat anymore. I sat upright, shoulders back, the bear resting on my lap as if it belonged there. I began to imagine leaving. Not out of anger this time, not as a punishment or a protest, but as a choice. To stand, to walk down the long corridor, to step outside into the cool air and breathe without waiting for someone else's permission. The idea no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like possibility. I wasn't ready yet. The pull of the room was still strong, the child inside still tethering me. But the seed had been planted. I could almost see myself walking away with dignity, not as someone excluded, but as someone who chose her own ground. For now, I stayed. But I stayed differently. Not as a shadow, but as a presence. Not as someone waiting for the door to open, but as someone learning that her worth didn't depend on it. I touched the bear's ears once more and whispered to myself, words no one else could hear, "You are not invisible. Not to yourself." And for the first time that night, I believed it. The night deepened, though in hospitals time doesn't announce itself the way it does outside. There was no sunset, no stars, just the steady hum of machines and the unchanging glow of ceiling lights. My body felt heavy, but inside me there was a surprising steadiness, as if the long hours of waiting had carved out something clear, something I hadn't touched in years. The door to the room opened once more. A nurse stepped out, jotting something on a chart. She smiled politely at me, then went on. No invitation followed, no gesture that said now you may enter. I felt the familiar pang of being left out, but it didn't swallow me whole this time. The ache was still there, but I recognized it for what it was, the mark of love wanting a place to land. I looked at the bear resting in my lap. For hours I had treated it like a ticket, proof of the love I wanted to deliver inside that room. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't a pass or a bargaining chip. It was just a piece of myself, a tender, imperfect creation. Whether or not it ever reached my grandchild's hands, it had value because I had made it. It was evidence of the love I carried, not dependent on anyone else to validate it. I smoothed its ears one last time, then tucked it back into my bag. Not in shame, not hidden away, but simply placed there with care. A part of me would carry it home, and that felt all right. At some point, my daughter emerged again. Her face was tired, her shoulders sagging. She didn't say much, only, "It's been a long night." Then she looked past me, her eyes scanning the hallway, as though I were a piece of furniture she hadn't expected to still see. She didn't ask me in. She didn't apologize. She just sighed softly and slipped back inside. Once, that would have gutted me. I would have sat there raw with longing, waiting for any scrap of inclusion. But now, as the door closed gently behind her, I realized I no longer needed it. Her choices were hers. My love was mine. I sat a little longer, listening to the hallway sounds, the wheels of a cart rattling, the buzz of the lights, the faint beep from the machines. And then I stood. Slowly, carefully, stretching my stiff legs, pressing my hand against the wall for balance. Standing felt like an act of defiance, though no one noticed. It was a choice, small but mine. I looked once more at the door. Light spilled faintly from beneath it, tracing a line across the floor. I whispered under my breath, "Be well, little one," words meant for my grandchild, though they'd never hear them. Then I turned and walked down the corridor. The walk was long, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. But each step felt lighter than the one before, as though I was shedding something with every pace. I passed the vending machines, the empty chairs, the nurse's station where no one looked up. I kept walking until the automatic doors opened and the cool night air met me. Outside, the world was quiet. The sky was dark, the parking lot mostly empty, but the air smelled like earth and grass, alive, unfiltered, not trapped under fluorescent hum. I stood there for a moment, filling my lungs with the coolness, feeling it settle in my chest. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't free of sorrow. But I was something I hadn't been for a long time, whole. As I walked to my car, I thought of the garden waiting for me at home, wild and overgrown. I thought of the chipped teapot, the stack of books, the quiet mornings that were mine alone. For so long I had waited at doorways, measuring myself by whether or not someone let me in. But tonight had taught me something: love doesn't vanish when it's unrecognized. It remains, steady as breath. I would keep loving my daughter. I would keep loving my grandchildren. But I would also turn some of that love inward, into the corners of my life I had neglected. Into my garden, into my knitting, into the quiet rituals that made me more than someone's mother or grandmother. The parking lot lights flickered above me as I unlocked the car. I placed my bag gently on the passenger seat, the bear tucked inside. My hands lingered on the steering wheel before I started the engine. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was retreating in defeat. I felt like I was choosing to carry myself home. As the car moved forward, I glanced once at the hospital building, its windows glowing softly in the night. Somewhere inside, my grandchild was sleeping, my daughter was keeping watch, and life was continuing without me. But that didn't erase me. I was still here. I still mattered. And I understood, finally, that sometimes the hardest doors remain closed, not to diminish us, but to remind us we can still stand on the other side, whole and unbroken.